Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode in our Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts series. In part 4 of our Mafia stories, we take a look at Aussie Bob, or Robert Trimbole. Bob was actually born Bruno Trimbole in 1931 to Italian immigrant parents from Plati in Calabria in Italy. They lived in the town of Griffith. He changed his name from Bruno to Bob, as it was more socially accepted to have a more Australian name, and took over the family farm at an early age. His parents sold their farm and moved to Fairfield. But Bob stays in Griffith. He trained to become a motor mechanic, buying a garage and pool shop. He was married to Joan Quested in 1953 and lived with Joan in Griffith too for a time. He leased a garage panel beating store, but the business does not go well. The store burns down and he also files for bankruptcy in 1968. His family at the time are living in housing commission in Griffith, borrowing milk and bread for the family to survive. Sometime though, things start to turn around for Bob and the family. The good thing about Aussie Bob was he was born in Australia, sounded Australian, looked Australian, and socialised and drank like an Australian. He knew how to play both sides though, as there was a steady flow of immigrants coming to Australia after World War II from his parents' home in Plati, Calabria in Italy. And he was like an interpreter for them. He knew the language, the Italian language, and he knew how to be an Aussie too. This meant he gained a lot more connections too, because a lot of the Ndrangheta came from Plati. So he would have found himself with the option of getting involved in organised crime. He met Gianfranco Frank Tazzoni, who was a Melbourne standover with ties to Griffith. Frank joins up with Bob to open a pinball machine sales and service store in 1970, and this partnership would go on into organised crime together. Aussie Bob was involved with the dealing of marijuana by the Ndrangheta. In 1972, Bob is able to open up a Texas Tavern wine bar in Griffith, as well as a butcher store. So things must have been pretty good at this time for him financially, or at least getting a lot better. He and Frank would distribute the marijuana from the Ndrangheta. Frank would take it to Melbourne, Bob would take it to Sydney, making it highly profitable for both men and the mafia. Bob only keeps the wine bar and butcher shop for a year before selling both and opening Sydney businesses at Casula Foodlands and Casula Cellars. Having his family in the Fairfield area, as well as many of the people from Plati moving to this area as well over the past decade, he's well connected. Bob is able to borrow a large amount of money to sort out his bankruptcy, which he pays back pretty swiftly with the sales from the marijuana. Not only being able to pay off his bankruptcy debt, he now has cash to throw around and starts splurging on his friends and family, as well as gambling at the races. Gambling at the races and putting bets on also gets him close to the big men of Sydney, who are also involved in organised crime, including the likes of George Freeman, a major SP bookmaker and a legal casino owner in Sydney. By 1973, he has separated from Jean, or at least is seeing someone new on the side. 27-year-old Englishwoman Anne-Marie Presland, who has a 4-year-old daughter from a previous relationship. He sets Joan up in Griffith in a large house, well looked after, with the 4 kids they have together. He also buys a retail store in Griffith that provides very well for his family in Griffith. In 1974, everyone attached to Bob is wealthy and living it up, especially those in Griffith, going from modest farms to mansions overnight, it seemed. It did not go unnoticed by local police and citizens from the Griffith area. They knew something was going on. Now the police, or local police, were easy to pay off. Earning the small wages they did, were very happy to take a bribe here and there. Most of them. And what could the community do about it if the police didn't? Well, if you haven't seen our last episode, including the Donald Mackay murder, go and have a look at it, because that all unfolded about now. Jack Ellis was Bob's man in the police, deflecting the heat in Griffith, along with Brian Berthwick and John Robbins. The Sydney cops weren't much chop either, it has been said, as was seen when Donald Mackay, furniture store owner and Liberal political candidate, was murdered, and the investigation into the murder was not handled very well from the local police or Sydney. It would be some time before they even got close to getting hold of Bob. Justice Stewart even said of the corruption in the Aussie police force, the whole lot could be bought for the price of a hamburger. A team of not-so-corrupt Sydney police investigated the murder. It was believed that Bob organised the hit on Donald Mackay, but they could not prove it, at least not then. Donald Mackay had wanted to stop the Ndrangheta from bringing down the reputation of their town, a town many had grown up in, as had their parents and grandparents had built. The Mafia wouldn't stand for this meddling in their affairs and wanted him gone. So he disappeared, and his body was never found. Life for Bob was back to normal after the death of Mackay in 1977. Aussie Bob, or Mr. Fix-It as he was also known. He got the name Mr. Fix-It as he was known for fixing horse races, paying jockeys not to win races. One jockey saying he would near strangle a horse before he would let it win, probably in fear of what would happen to him if he had. Bob was known for one time buying 13 out of 14 jockeys to fix a race. That's how serious he was. Bob met Terry Clark somewhere around 1975-76, probably around the time Bob was becoming filthy rich and being able to fix races. Terry was part of the Mr. Asia drug syndicate, known for smuggling drugs across Asia, UK, Australia and New Zealand, and at the end into the US as well. Mr. Asia was made up of New Zealand mates, Marty Johnston, Andy Mayer, Terry Clark, Greg Ollard and Jim Shepherd, as well as a bunch of others, including wives, girlfriends and mates, who were drug mules and others in distribution. Terry connected himself with Aussie Bob and was able to get a green light, so to speak. Lawyers, magistrates, cops, all the way up, and including narcotics units, were paid off, and Mr. Asia could keep running and run well into Australia. This agreement worked well for Bob. He was racking up debts himself and making money through Clark to pay them off, as well as splashing out where he liked. He didn't seem to live the crazy life that others in the syndicate did, but he was still in the thick of it, having the connections to arrange hits if any of the syndicate got caught and squealed. And they did, or at least could. And that was good enough for Terry. He figured better to be safe than sorry. They had to expand their players, as the top Kiwi crew already had heat on them in New Zealand. Many had fled the land of the Kiwi for Australia and Marty Johnston to Singapore, where he set himself up to avoid the heat back home. Australia was a safe place for a time, at least while the police were able to be bribed. But it was not going to last for a few reasons, but mainly because the guys in the syndicate took too much of the drugs they were selling. Silly mistakes were made, and Terry became paranoid and couldn't stop his insatiable appetite for women, which upset more than just his wife, but his girlfriends, as well as the other women he was sleeping with, who were part of the drug mules. One in particular, Alison Dine, was one that he really shouldn't have crossed. She had been a kindergarten teacher back home in New Zealand and had fallen in love with Terry, believing he truly loved her. She would do anything for Terry, including almost ruin her entire life, as did many of the girls that he seduced. But you couldn't say that the girls didn't know what they were getting involved with. They were taking drugs from country to country. Surely you've got to know that that's wrong. But they had a lot of fun spending the proceeds. Lavish parties and all the money and drugs you could want. It would have been quite alluring, even for innocent people. But Terry made the girls jealous of each other. One of the group's members even stated that they were constantly getting STDs from each other. Everyone was sleeping with everyone, except Aussie Bob. But this high life would come to an end, an earlier end for some. One of his glamour drug mules was found tied to the anchor of a boat in Sydney Harbour in 1975. This may have been one of the first murders involved with Mr. Asia. Apart from the death of Terry's second wife, Norma Fleet, who was apparently knocked off too. But it didn't stop there. Terry started killing off some of his top men, one by one, in fear that they would talk once they were nabbed by police. Or, if they had been nabbed, if they had talked. Some of which he was able to pay off for the recorded tapes of those who'd squealed. The first of the syndicate to go down, apart from the young girl, was Greg Allard and girlfriend Julie Thalman. They were head of his distribution in Australia, but they wanted out. Greg apparently told Terry he wanted out, and it ended in their deaths. He also had mate Andy Mayer knock off Marty Johnston, who was pretty much the guy that started it with him. With Marty now dead, as well as Greg Allard, Marty's mate Henry Lewis was murdered, one that Terry states he was responsible for. Also known as Pommy, Lewis had absconded on bail and wanted more money for the risk. Terry believed his risk was greater keeping Lewis alive. Terry had a thing for cutting hands and heads off the bodies, as well as smashing in teeth, probably so that they wouldn't have been identified, or at least he hoped they wouldn't. Then the husband and wife team that took over from Greg Allard and Julie Thalman were the Wilsons, Doug and Isabel, who enjoyed too much of the high life and drugs. It was in their arrest and deaths that things really began to unravel. Bob wasn't part of this high life and constant orgy living style that the others were accustomed to. He was older and liked his own creature comforts, his young woman Anne-Marie and his restaurant. And of course, the track. That was the way, of course, with the Ndrangheta and the Mafia, not to bring too much attention, not to be noticed. Better to live well and very modestly. Bob too had his own problems going on. He found out that he had prostate cancer, which was slowly going to kill him.
He had a pocket full of bloody 50s. He rested his 420 pie on top of his can and shook me fucking hand, and I had to wipe the fucking shit off me fucking hand like that. Fucking dirty bastard, you know? And he was the boss of the fucking Italian underworld in Griffith. Jesus Christ. He might have had a lot of money, but he didn't spend it on fucking, on dress, on clothes. He was wearing a fucking 2-bob bloody Silvertech suit. You remember the ad? That's a great bag of fruit. That's a Silvertech suit. A bloody 2-bob glow wave shirt. Oh, geez, he looked a mess.
Spending time in Brisbane to escape some of the heat in Sydney, there was a rowdy party at a hotel in Brisbane, which brought about police attention, and all involved were arrested. But the Queensland police weren't the New South Wales police and weren't easily bought off. The Wilsons were kept for days being questioned, and it may have been withdrawal of the drugs that they partied so hard on, or possible jail time, but they spilled the beans on the operation. It was the beginning of the end for the Mr. Asia syndicate. The Wilsons squealed hard. They exposed where bodies had been buried, who had murdered them, those involved in the Mr. Asia syndicate, as well as their deep fear that Terry Clark would have them murdered. And the cops recorded it all on tape. They were going to get immunity, but not witness protection. And this was where the police failed. They didn't provide safety for the Wilsons. And of course, well, you know how Terry likes it. But Terry couldn't do the job this time. He had to lay low, calling on Aussie Bob to fix it. Bob organises Gianfranco, his mate, Frank Tazzoni, to contact someone to get the job done, to kill off the Wilsons. They go to the same man that did the Donald Mackay murder, Fred, but through a man named George Joseph. So they didn't deal directly with Fred themselves. Fred we would later know as James Frederick Baisley. Now he was supposed to be the guy that put his victims through a meat mincer. At least that's what the guys were told, and what Aussie Bob told Terry Clark. But he doesn't do this, at least not for the Wilsons. Bob was quite impressed with the meat grinder scenario. It was very Mafia-esque. But as it were not true, the Wilsons' bodies surfaced in shallow graves south of Melbourne. The dog that they loved so much and had with them all the time was found 6 kilometres away. Apparently Fred had a thing for animals. Understandable. Well, Terry was irate. The Wilsons' death confirmed everything that they'd said to police. They'd had it recorded, everything on a tape, which was, luckily for Terry, made available to him through his crooked lawyer, Brian Alexander. But not before the information had been heard by the police, and they knew where bodies were and who was responsible for them, as well as naming Terry as their own future murderer. But it also cost the police force as well. There was names in the corruption which verified what many had already known. Now the Premier at the time wanted a task force to investigate into this Mr. Asia syndicate and close it down, as well as close down the corruption that was rife through the New South Wales police force, as well as the recovery of all the dead that spanned from Australia, New Zealand and the UK. Well, Terry made a run for it. He headed to the UK with his then lover, Karen Soich, a Kiwi lawyer who had helped him in a couple of his encounters with the law. But although they had a great time, it was all coming to an end. Bob had bought the Aussie New Zealand part of Mr. Asia's syndicate from Terry when the heat got too much, including Alison Dine, his ex-girlfriend, and the operation that she was running for Terry, which included young beautiful women and secret compartments in suitcases. This was all going well for the girl until one of the girls that she'd recruited was caught. She did talk, but she didn't know much, so part of the operation was safe, at least they thought. Terry had fled and they couldn't get him right away, but they knew where Alison was and they grabbed her before she could get away. Although they searched the house that Terry owned in Australia, where Alison had been doing the business from, they weren't able to find any drug paraphernalia or anything that linked them to it, so they had to let Alison go. But this worried Alison, and she became a nervous wreck. At this point, Terry believes she's probably spoken to the police, or if not, she will. He organises Aussie Bob to take out Alison. But Bob was a softie for the ladies. He had daughters himself, and he couldn't kill her. Sadly, this would mean later on that Bob himself would have to split from Australia. Alison got on the next flight to America and tried to keep a low profile. But perhaps she was using her own passport or one of the aliases the police may have known about, and it wasn't long before they tracked her down. At the same time, bodies were showing up everywhere, all leading to Terry Clark. They had to get Alison back, and they located her. This would mean the end of Mr. Asia Syndicate for good. Alison had to talk and get it off her chest, not just because she was going to do hard time, but because she was a broken woman. Broken not just because she'd been found out, but because Terry Clark had wounded her. And I guess now it's a bit of revenge. Terry and Karen in London were arrested after the body of Marty Johnston surfaced. Apparently, when Andy Mayer was getting rid of him, he mustn't have put him down deep enough because he was found. Alison took the stand and had Terry put away. They had him on several murder charges as well as the drug syndicate. He was going away for a very long time. Although he had planned to escape, it is said, Terry Clark died in jail from a heart attack in 1983. It is not known, but heavily speculated, that the almost 40-year-old may have brought about his own heart attack in a ploy to later escape from hospital, but had accidentally killed himself. Or others believe, including the last man standing, Diamond Jim or Jim Shepherd, that somebody acted revenge on him and had him killed in jail. Could it have been one of the ladies he'd left behind? Or one of the corrupt cops that he'd put into trouble? Either way, Terry Clark was dead, and with it, the Mr. Asia Syndicate. Aussie Bob had lost out on his business venture with Terry, which also caused him significant attention, especially after Alison named him too in the syndicate. Bob was tipped off that they were about to nab him when the Mr. Asia thing went sideways, and Bob left Australia in 1981 with Anne-Marie for Ireland and a couple of other stops on the way. He was only arrested once in Ireland after being watched by the Irish police in his dealings with the IRA, supplying them with arms, it was believed.
With all organised crime, there is a hierarchy, a leader. With the Mafia, it's a godfather.
But he managed to get off due to lack of evidence. Shortly after, though, he leaves Ireland for Spain. They were very careful not to make phone calls home to Australia, despite their families still being there. It is believed that family members had come out to meet them during the next 5 years of Bob's life. If he was involved with Dr. Nick Paltos, the heavy gambler and one of George Freeman's mates back in Sydney, his cancer medication or painkillers would have been stopped around 1986 when Paltos was convicted of conspiracy to import hashish into Australia. It is not known for sure if Bob was also in on that deal. As for Bob's hitmen, well, Frank Tazzoni got 8 years. He had to spill the beans on the hitmen. George Joseph got 18 months. And John Frederick Baisley got 12 years. They couldn't find the body of Donald Mackay, but they knew he'd done it. But it wasn't long before Bob succumbed to the cancer. Anne-Marie would return home, and Bob's body was also robbed before it could be shipped home. They took his suit and jewellery, leaving his corpse quite naked, to the rage of his family. Speaking of rage, at his funeral, Bob went out with a bang. News crews and the media created a circus outside the Catholic Church in Smithfield, creating a punch-up. Even Prime Minister Bob Hawke got in trouble for congratulating one reporter on defending himself at the funeral. Crazy times. But it doesn't conclude our Mafia stories just yet. For even present at Bob's funeral was a young man who, too, would feature in his own Mafia story, and one of ours. As for Alison, after she testified and put them all away, or most of them away, she was given immunity and put into witness protection, where she has lived ever since. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and hit that notification bell so you're aware when we put up more Mafia Stories of Australia.
Robert Trimbole was a fat, pie-eating wog who Horatio Morris introduced me to Melbourne Cup Day, 1973. And I met Robert Trimbole, a big fat, he had half a 4 and 20 pint in the front of his bloody shirt. He'd urine stains in the front of his pants. He'd bloody well speared up over, he looked a bloody treat. And he had a bloody pocket full of dough.